Well, Jared, Stacy, welcome to Masala Theology. This is a space where we spice up our spiritual journeys by, really just spicing it up with ancient, liberative, Jesus-centered, justice-oriented ways um, of following Jesus in our world today. And Jared, you have an exciting new book that just came out, Reality and Ruins. Incredible cover, by the way. I mean, it's just one
Yeah,
of those
yeah.
memorable.
They give the credit to the designer. We have
Yeah.
Adam Beta to thank for that, and they did a great job. They did a really good job.
My My goodness. And Jared, like your book is making waves. Like day one, you get a hit
Yeah,
piece from Christianity Today, which is like a dream for so many first-time authors. And
yeah. Well, it really is an honor. I mean, truly, the to have that sort of engagement and focus. For an outlet that I've written for in the past, and that sort of engagement. I mean, from an academic point of view, this comes with the territory.
yeah,
Engagement with criticism and all of that is very much part of dialogue, and I think like it wasn't a positive review. Um, overall, there were parts of it that I think were definitely captured well, but I do just want to speak to like the point of the book is about a willingness to dialogue and engage. Um, when reality would have us sort of embrace the fractures of our world as sort of the borders that we're not going to cross. Um, your title is Masala Chai. My title for my Substack is No Man's Land, and that's very much
mm,
because it's this place where I feel as though there's really powerful conversations. And I saw him come on Amar Peterman and his book Becoming Neighbors, right? That verb, becoming neighbors. I think that's these spaces are where that sort of thing can happen. So, you want to take it in stride, and you want to acknowledge that someone read the book and took time, to do that. Um, and I'm very much feeling like even after week one, the work is only getting started. Like there's a lot of conversations
yeah.
that this book starts, and it's not always easy conversations. I use the word subversive a lot.
Love that, Jared. And if you're just joining us, Jared wrote this incredible book called Reality and Ruins: How Conspiracy Theory Became an American Evangelical Crisis. I feel like this is what so many of us are dealing with around our Thanksgiving or Christmas dinner tables. I know I certainly have. Maybe some of us know people who were at the January 6th Capitol insurrection. I certainly do. Maybe people at church. You've lost people at church. Maybe you've had to leave a church community because of how pervasive conspiracy theories are in the church. And it's just something important for us to wrestle with. Like, why is this happening? And how do we heal from this? How do we heal from this disillusion and reality? And Jared, your book is so good. I've got to read it and actually listen to the audiobook version of it to get through
Good.
quicker, which you
That's great.
narrated, which
Yeah.
was
No,
incredible.
I think it's actually my preferred way of engaging with the book. Some of your readers are probably very well attuned to the fact that the scriptures were originally oral, right? Like this was
Mm,
Romans was performed, right? By a woman to the church in Rome. And so there was something really special, I think, at conveying a meaning when I could match my tone to the words on the page. That's not to, it's certainly more accessible. But yeah, I'm glad to hear that. If there are people
yeah.
that I like that because well, it was a fun process. But also at the same time, like there's quite a few portions in the book where my tone and voice is able to convey a little bit more meaning than reading on a page. So I'm
Yeah.
curious to hear that. Just a sidebar.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, as someone who also thankfully got to narrate his own
Yeah,
audiobook, totally resonate with that. Like, there's nothing like hearing the tone of the author and not assuming the worst. I feel like if you're going to write a hit piece on a book, and if the author has narrated the book, maybe maybe listen to the audio too first as a better
Yeah.
practice, you know. I don't know, we can talk about that forever. But Jared, before we even go into the book
Sure.
and the content and the meat of it, something I want to do is just give respect where respect is due. Um, you know, you and I are accustomed to hearing about books that come out by really big names that aren't well thought through, that are more opinion than research, that aren't really serious. And unfortunately, you know, so much of the Christian publishing industry doesn't really fact check people come through. But, you know, in case you didn't know this about Jared's book, Jared, this was your PhD thesis at um, Edinburgh. Is that where you went? Uh,
Aberdeen.
Aberdeen. I'm so sorry.
Oh
Yeah,
no, it's fine. I love Uni of Edinburgh people too.
yeah. It's like
No, it was,
rivalry
yeah,
there,
no, it's
Scottish
fine.
rivalry. But this was your PhD thesis, and this was like peer reviewed. This is like, you know, you have to defend it in a dissertation with other academics. Like anyone who has researched anything about a PhD or done a PhD knows the academic level of intellectual seriousness that goes into this. So for Christianity Today to put out a hit piece dismissing this as, you know, intellectually lazy and things like that is just honestly intellectually dishonest in itself, because this is a such a well thought through research that you then convert it into something that's more accessible for everyday people. So I just want to start with that acknowledgement of
Yeah.
that reality here,
Yeah.
Jared, and commend you for.
I mean, and I wrote a little bit about it today, just to convey like the challenge involved in this, and you know, there's a huge amount of distrust in expertise and academic institutions for a lot of reasons, um, and and so scholars who are trying to do public work for the public good, like have a particular responsibility. And then when you adjust for the fact that I'm trained as a theologian, right, for the church, that's an extra layer. And so
Yeah,
distilling a lot of this is hard, is difficult, and I'd be the first one to say like the execution of that is always up for conversation. Like how well does this compare to what was in the dissertation? And that's part of the venture of writing. But I do appreciate it. I mean, these were a lot of this was kind of pulled together over the course of many years, and working through that, distilling it down. And like there were elements, people who've read the book will know that there's sort of a chapter devoted to history. Well, that chapter was distilled down. But even if
hmm
right, like I'm not writing, this isn't a dissertation of just history. I pulled episodes from evangelical history. And even in the book I sort of frame that as saying, look, this isn't like a whole picture. These are key episodes that show a particular dimension of something that we're talking about. So before we rush to kind of say, hey, there's a really easy way to organize a history to justify a certain view or definition. But what we want to do is kind of show the way that conspiracy theory is hung inside this house, and what it does and how it operates. And so, I'm getting into the
yeah,
weeds because I really do enjoy that work. But then, to your point, there's a responsibility right now for people who do this work and are engaged in scholarship to meet the moment. And I say it
yeah.
often in the book that you don't have to have letters behind your name to be a witness.
Mm.
That sort of gatekeeping is not something that the church can really be involved in. At
Yeah.
the same time, we have to recognize where limits are and where expertise lies in certain ways. And so that's a very much ongoing conversation all through this, but I appreciate the acknowledgement, and to me, it's probably important for me to point out to the numerous people that represent, the Aberdeen community.
Mhm.
This was not done in isolation. I did not lock myself in a room for 4 years. There were so many people, and they show up in the acknowledgments. They show up in the book, and it's actually pretty important right now for me to acknowledge. One of the theologians I quote in this book passed away last week.
Mhm.
And if I can, just bolster his work and his witness here, I will. He was the external examiner of my PhD, and I was able to send him, a copy of the book with a letter before he passed. And so that was very meaningful. And just, for everyone listening, like um, there's theology that has been passed along over the course of this. And what's very interesting about Hans and his project and work is that he studied under Bonhoeffer's contemporaries after the war. So you're talking about someone who was a direct link to the confessing church and the struggle. And you know about this in your work in decolonial, post-colonial. you know his generation was the generation who went to school in the 60s and found out that many of their professors were avowed Nazis that never sort of recanted, and it was just this silence. And so
Mm,
he's in Germany, there was this, sort of youth movement that pushed back on colonialism, that pushed back on the sort of latent Nazi emphasis. So, I say all that to say, there's a bunch of stories and influences that come together to build something I think that's more than just an argument. It's a community. So I'm indebted to Aberdeen and for the time that we spent there. And you got to stop me because I literally will keep talking. I
no, but I think the takeaway I want for us here is that one of the critiques in the Christianity Today piece of reviewing your book is that you're letting your personal pain and hurt and experiences kind of dictate your perspective.
yeah.
um and one, I want to acknowledge that post that's Western Enlightenment bullcrap, right? Like just detecting just essentially having this posture of lived experience
Mm,
is bad. You can't go by that. If that was bad, we wouldn't have the gospels today. We wouldn't have the gospels from different perspectives today, right?
yeah.
Like what is this bogus kind of way of looking at theology?
I was asked a question about that, and I it does strike me like one of the things that was really pressing in on me as I was sort of bringing in elements of my story is what James Baldwin says about sentimentality. That
Yeah.
it's sort of arc of dishonesty, and that like really really or really expressive displays of emotion can sometimes he said mask this the lack of experience with life. And I thought that was really insightful. The ways that, we try to tell a story that is ultimately sort of distorting. And, but on the other hand, in a positive sense, um, let me just put it this way. When it comes to my story, I say in the book, this is a very particular experience. And James Joyce, the Irish novelist, and I quote him in the book by saying, the particular is the window into the universal. And I think when it comes to doing theology, when it comes to talking about God, it is only ever, beginning with our personal experiences, what we've
Mm,
inherited. And far be it from us, to cast to make that the line, to make that the standard. But when someone like you and I talk, I'm talking to someone who's your experience, which you've been very public about, right? It's not just that you were on a pathway into the GOP, but that also you come from a tradition of truly ancient Christianity through the continent of India. And so for me to talk about my past and talk about my story is not to disconnect myself from it.
yeah.
Um, but it is to acknowledge its influence. And there's always, right, that temptation to sort of draw some distance and say like, well, I'm we are not the same, as a way to justify whatever it is you're trying to say. But I happen to think that doing theology, and I quote Stanley Hauerwas in this, is memory is a moral exercise, and
Yes.
that includes remembering who we were and the perspectives of God that we inherited, but that we also taught. And thankfully, I think God's more committed to disrupting, our views of Him than we are. But in some ways, I understand where and how that criticism comes from. But hopefully, people hear too,
Right.
how I think about it, and that
Yeah.
sometimes the beginning place for starting about talking about theology and God does begin with saying, where were you raised, and what was important to you, and who showed up in your life. Those aren't those aren't questions that lack, theological
Mm,
content. I mean, they're full of it, and very rich. And so I understand, how easy it may be to dismiss that, especially when um, social media sort of incentivizes and
mm,
sensationalizes all of that. And it's very easy to be dismissive and callous. But this
yeah,
book is really
yeah,
written to validate people's pain, to validate
yeah.
people.
No, I love that. Love that. And yeah, again, the takeaway from this part of the conversation really is, kudos to you, Jared, for bringing your full self into the academic world, your pain, your lived experience, your trauma, and resisting by giving that deep thought,
Mhm.
in very contemplative, ancient ways, even, and doing that in community,
Right.
with your community at Aberdeen, and then I mean, you didn't have to put this into the
Yeah.
format of a book, but you did that. And
I will say this. There was a part of me that didn't want to.
mm,
It's me, I'm very comfortable sort of hiding in academic abstraction and concepts, right? Like it's a real safe place. And I'll tell you how where I'm learning that, and that's a growth edge. Is like I'm currently a chaplain,
mm,
and so in some of the work that I've done through that, has just revealed, right? Like, yeah, like the certainty of like academia and academic concepts is a real safe place. Um, and one of the encouragements that I had from, and I see her on the call, and I'll just give her a shout out, is Morgan, our shared agent. But I will say that her influence, editor's influence, my family's influence on this. I mentioned the book is dedicated to my wife Stevie, and so we're talking about a story that we've lived, and so the recognition that hey, for this book to have a sort of grittiness and it touches the ground, that meets people in the resonances of their own experiences, right? Because I'm not the first nor the last, and none of us are, to have an encounter with this in a very unique way. But to be able to say that these pages in some ways needed to bleed, there
mm,
a pulse to this. Um, and I think, you know what, where do we get that from? I mean, we get it from the scriptures. The shape of the Christian story is very much about the rawness of human experience and the God who encounters us in that. And so yeah, there's certainly ways that we can dismiss that as self-obsessed individualism and all of those sorts of things. But it's another thing entirely to recognize that God meets us for who we are, where,
mm,
and so there was a version of this book that
mm,
exists in conceptual hypothetical form that was all you know just concepts. Um, but the version that came out was much more painful. It would have been really easy just to say, "Oh, turn this into your dissertation into a book," but this was much. And I hope I conveyed that, in the pages, that people sense there's a liveness to this, a pulse to it, that reflects not just the work I do now, but also the pain and the loss that brings people to the title alone
mm,
and
yeah,
says, I feel that. That's
yeah,
that's I think what I'm seeing a lot of is just this attraction to even the conversation, even if some of the conclusions that are drawn out in the book are surprising. One of the things I'm trying to acknowledge and open up in the book is that before we get in conversations about definitions or how to define all this, many of us have had to work up our own accounts, our own explanations on the fly, not because we're all like very interested in writing substacks about it, but because we're having to explain to ourselves the loss and the pain involved. And
mm,
it's especially difficult when that loss and pain intersects with what we've called Christianity, with who we've referred to as Jesus Christ. And that is opening up, you know, before it opens up questions about like how do you define that? It's opening up questions about who's wounded in the midst of it, and where do we need to go to create a space not for just conversation but also presence.
mm, mm. I love that, Jared. Jared, talk to us a little bit about holy paranoia,
Yeah.
something you keep referring to throughout the book,
Yeah.
and a very helpful concept in unpacking this. Um, but
Yeah.
really, like, tell us about holy
Sure.
paranoia a little bit.
Sure. So, holy paranoia is my way of sort of naming the crisis in the title, right? Like, so reality in ruins, how conspiracy theory became an American evangelical crisis. Well, what's the crisis? And a lot of the assumptions of what the crisis is that, white evangelicals in America are crazy, like a pathological term. That they quote unquote we don't live in reality, or all of those sorts of things. And there may be vestiges of, like, we just are reaching for words to try to explain this problem. Um, and in the book, I gesture a lot towards, like, the importance of facts, but also the limits of facts.
Mhm.
When facts don't matter is when there's a primal story being told. And so holy paranoia is my way of naming the crisis, and it's a very specific one, and it's a theological crisis. That's not to say that there aren't crises of expertise other places. We're living in a moment that is probably best described as a poly crisis, right? It's like it's everything, everywhere, all the time. And so what this book is doing is very modest, and what holy paranoia refers to is, my use of the word holy, I just say, is, it's very simple, it just means other, right? A different sort of paranoia. Um and that sort of paranoia is, I just look at the word and take it very literally, para, alongside, and noia, mind, so split mind. And to this sort of concept is my way of really introducing Christology, to use a theological term,
Mhm.
but really introducing just Jesus. That at the heart of conspiracy theory as a storytelling act, right? So that's how I define it. Very existential, something that's going on, something that you can't always pin down with fact checking, because if conspiracy theory is anything, it's just always changing. There's always another one. You can't really
Mhm.
bottle it up. Um, but at the heart of this is a holy paranoia, a Jesus who's caught between a certain telling of the story of America, an empire, and a certain telling of the Christian story. And there's a confusion in the midst of that. And so while this may sound original, it's my honor, really, and privilege to say nothing about that is truly original. Um, and in the book, I'll quote a German theologian, Eberhard Bethage, but then I'll go back farther and quote Frederick Douglass, who identified, from within the African American tradition in this country, and Black theology has always really had a very clear eyed view that just because someone names Jesus, doesn't mean that it's the Jesus of the scriptures. And so that's very obvious to many, but it's not obvious to all. And
Mm.
by doing this, by kind of invoking holy paranoia, um, there's sort of some clandestine reliance on Cone, on Thurman,
Mm.
on currents of Black and African American theology that has developed from beneath and below American empire. And so when you do that, and you cite that and you credit it, suddenly the answer is not, well, I'm not doing anything novel. Um, I'm literally bringing the insights of
Mm.
from beneath American empire, um, into the heart of stories that have been told, because maintaining that empire creates a lot of anxiety. It creates
Wow.
fear. But the good thing that, um, I've found, and your work is standing on this foothold, Joash, is that these answers have persisted across the history of the church. Yes, like,
Mm.
through a lot of violence, through a lot of malformed, disoriented theologies, but also there's always been this faithful uh, witness that emerges, from time to time in very key ways. And so I feel it's important, like, to acknowledge that
Yeah.
and say, if this sounds novel, maybe it's because it's not me as a new scholar saying it, but because the likes of Cone and Gutierrez, and Thurman, at least in the 20th century, haven't made their way into
Yeah.
these spaces. And so credit, to where credit is due.
I love that, Jared. I love that framing, and that humility and acknowledgement. What I hear you saying is, we have so much to learn from
Yeah.
people who've been trampled under the boot of empire and still manage to see Jesus
Mhm.
in there
Yep.
somewhere, right?
Yep.
Like I'm thinking of my ancient St. Thomas Indian Christian ancestors who I write about in my book, The Justice of Jesus, where basically there was this clash of two Christianities that occurred
Right.
when the colonizers came over, the Portuguese Catholic colonizers came over and brought their version of Jesus, right? And you talked about this with, yeah, like two different Jesuses being reckoned with here in the public square today. There's nothing new about this. Like
Right.
with my ancestors, you know, the Jesus they knew was more interested in them being transformed into the image of Christ and acting like Jesus in our world today. Um, Whereas the post-Western Enlightenment, Jesus that they were presented with by their Portuguese and Dutch and British colonizers was more interested in dogma and
Mhm.
what you believed and believing the right set of propositions versus being Jesus in the world today. And those are two very different versions of Christianity.
Right. I mean, one sees Christianity as a resource for civilization building, and the other sees it as a community that's being formed and that may challenge, those structures and systems. I and just to kind of draw a point of correspondence and say, yeah, like we're walking along that same path. Is that Whitfield is one of those historical episodes that I deal with in the book,
Yeah,
um, and how the conspiracy theory, right?
yeah.
The anxiety of revolts from enslaved people, that narrative of, the enslaved among us are going to uprise. That anxiety was also pressed down by a gospel that promised to make enslaved people obedient and subservient, and so the ways that conspiracy theory is sort of this act of storytelling sort of converge with the gospel, right? To basically make it so that it's very difficult to suggest, well, is this authentically Christ that we're encountering? Um, or is it a Jesus who in many ways leaves us to our, preferred systems, our preferred
Mm,
structures, and blesses everything that we assume and take for granted as given and also necessary. We're hearing a lot of that sort of language now, around us about what's necessary. And I think one of the cash outs of the book is to really encounter Jesus is to really be brought face to face with uncertainty. Um, what did the disciples ask Jesus after his resurrection? Is now the time? Are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel? Right? Like, oh, now we're making Israel great again. Like now is the time. And Jesus responds with a very cryptic, admittedly statement. Now is not the time for you to know. You will be witnesses. um, and I write about this in the book, and I've since developed language to talk about this too. Is that I think when the
mm,
church embraces this sort of uncertainty, I do think that one of the cash outs of that is that it can benefit democracy. Uh,
mm.
it can benefit the church inhabiting a common political world where rights and justice are constituted like in a temporal sense. But
Wow.
to your book and your point, right, the justice of Jesus creates a very unique community in the midst of any political order,
Mm,
democracy, communism, socialism, and to that extent, the putting down our need to narrate things with certainty um, creates a lot of peril and a lot of danger. But putting down those stories, I think, really reminds the church of who we are called to be. And the difficult ask in all of that is realizing that, again, is Christianity a resource for civilization building, uh,
Hmm.
or is it and the content that can generate, or is it communion? And communion with God is a radically subversive thing. And
Hmm.
that's the language I used in the beginning part of the book, just to name. I think what a lot of people probably feel is that the question of what Christianity means in America is very much not just an unresolved question, but almost like an open wound that
Hmm.
we've not fully addressed.
Wow. Wow. I love that. Well, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about evangelicals,
Yeah,
um, core subject in your book. And, so many people listening to this or watching this come from evangelical backgrounds, like both of us do.
mm,
And the two of us, have actually gotten to be trained
yep,
theologically in, the best of the evangelical tradition, really. And we don't identify as evangelicals today. We share that in common. And I mean, just for context, folks watching, listening, Jared and I have been online friends for a
yeah,
number of years
yeah,
now, back
yeah,
to Twitter days,
yeah,
and probably 5, 6 years, I think, at this point. And like I think we were both once a part of this movement to like even like redefine
yeah,
evangelicalism a little bit and
oh,
reclaim it.
yeah,
And it seems like both of us have just given up at this point and being like, let's just build from scratch. Let's just, go all the way back to ancient Christianity, build from there. But, talk to me a little bit about evangelicalism and why you focus so much of it in the book. And I
yeah,
want to contrast that with a critique that's also in the Christianity Today review, which is this isn't unique or original to evangelicalism, right? So how would you respond to that critique that conspiracy theory isn't unique or original to evangelical Christianity? And yeah, why do you focus so much on evangelicalism?
yeah. So, I mean, I could. There's a couple of ways we can answer this question, and I've already answered it in one way is to say, well, it's my people. Um,
Mm,
I'm a son of this house, and so for those who haven't read the book or aren't familiar with my story, I have no problem saying I went to a non-denominational school that was affiliated with D.L. Moody and Moody Bible Institute growing up. I went to Jerry Falwell's Liberty University. I was a Southern Baptist pastor, and so I've spent time in these spaces. But there are also, and I mentioned this in the book, like when it comes to defining evangelicalism, we get into a lot of difficulty. And to put that simply, and I mentioned in the book, every definition can sort of serve as a scheme of justification, right? Like if we start drawing the lines and saying, well, these are the real evangelicals, and these aren't. It would take January 6th, right? Like depending on the definition that you use, we can end up sort of absolving ourselves from naming and reckoning with evangelical influence on that day.
mm,
If you sort of conclude that, well, the guy who was the QAnon shaman is not an evangelical, then we don't have to deal with all of this other stuff. um, and so I'm sort of intentionally subversive in that point, and just kind of pointing out that we have to be careful about the definitions that we use, because I'm interested in what's going on in between the gaps of these definitions. I think that's where it's most prophetically, theologically, um, interesting is the wrong word, but vital maybe, that we
mm,
sort of name what's at stake in the definitions that we make. Mainly because of what I've just described, like no true Scotsman, right? Like we can very easily, no real evangelical be doing XYZ. So there have been books, there's whole careers that are staked on this sort of question, and I'm not discounting it. I'm saying that these histories matter, but theologically engaging with them as I do in the book, I do it because I'm a son of this house, and the criticism that sort of offer like, well, this isn't original to evangelicalism. I say in the book it's not. Like I make that point that
mm,
it's at several points that conspiracy theory is something that's linked up with modernity and the Enlightenment. There are factors in how we think about conspiracy theory that are just in the air we breathe, and it doesn't matter whether you're left ideologically or right ideologically or an evangelical or not. Um, to give people an example of this, when I was studying this for my dissertation, I talked with a pastor in Australia on the other side of the world. And it was during COVID. It was in the middle of the pandemic. And we were saying, well, in my context, the Americans think that COVID emerged from China. And in your context, there's Chinese nationals who think that COVID emerged from America. And so again, not to get in the whole COVID origins question, but it's a very good example of how conspiracy theory doesn't really have ideological headquarters, how parts of it are just part of living in a modern world, and also the material
Mm.
of our digital connections. So I hope I've spoken enough to make my point, which I make in the book several times, that it it doesn't always come directly from evangelicalism, and I never make the claim that it does.
Yeah.
What I do make the claim is that as it arises, whether from the United States, as it arises from our condition of modernity and how we think of ourselves as individuals, there's a really interesting section about that where I cite some research into individualism and how that factors in. Um, so
Mm.
as it does all that, though, my point is, as an evangelical, like, I witnessed and saw and imbibed conspiracy theories meshed up in Christianity, like myself personally. And I tell some of those stories in the book. But not only is that an anecdote, but looking around, we can point to sociological data that shows, for example, when QAnon was very big, and we have to rethink a lot of that, likely socially engineered in some respects from the Epstein files. We're seeing parts of that. And this is a point that I'll just add here, is that truth is always slow. Like, truth is always
Mm.
slow. Conspiracy theory is very fast. Moving on through this, though, the last thing I'll say
Mm.
is that because evangelicalism is in America, like, just by virtue of the fact of its influence, and I'm talking materially, the amount of media that it owns and operates, the institutions, all of that together, evangelicalism maybe just isn't theological beliefs that people hold. It's also something people consume. And,
Wow.
and insofar as it's something that people consume, right, we're not just talking about affinity for a certain set of theological beliefs or belonging. We're talking about the very weird, wild enmeshment of all of these factors, so that, and this is the argument I make in the book, when someone in 2021, 2020 was going to church and hearing Chris Tomlin songs and on Sunday morning on their stage, then they drive home and they hear the same song on the radio. But then they turn that radio on their commute the next day and they're hearing conservative talk radio talk about election fraud. Who There's no mediation between that. But there's something being consumed and imbibed. So my point in responding to that criticism is saying, I've never said that
Yeah.
it emerges uniquely from evangelicalism. It's in the air. It's everywhere. But something very unique happens when it enters into evangelical culture, the evangelical
Mm.
and to put it very simply, what I'm arguing is that when that referral happens, when it gets referred and takes hold inside, it gets a theological charge. That by association, these narratives, it's not just that Democrats are the opposing party, it's that they're demonically influenced. And that's a whole theologically charged pathway that I have colleagues who do social science and are working on this from that. And we're always talking about the fact that there's no fact checking that.
Hmm.
There's no fact checking that because it's doing something theological. So all of this is in the book, and I think that's how I would respond to that. Just briefly
Yeah.
here, reviewing some of those things. Is that, I've never claimed that it does, uniquely do this. Um,
Yeah.
we also adjust for some sociological data, which I cite. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
there's some things that show white evangelicalism as a sociological reality outpaces a lot of religious expressions for affinity with that. But I'm trying to also get to the theological point behind that and the points of contact for how it gets power and fuel. Um, but yeah, I'd be the first one to say there's data
Yeah.
that would suggest there's a greater affinity that kind of overlaps
Yes.
with Christian nationalism too. So that was
Yes.
I appreciate you going down that road, because that gave me an opportunity to offer a pretty thorough summary of some of what's in the book
Yeah.
to that point.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, I would also add, if you look at the history of evangelicalism,
Yeah.
um, it's an empire-shaped religion. that is the history. It's been in bed with especially the American empire, and then it's exported that way of thinking into the global south through global missions.
Yeah.
There's so much history of the CIA, taking on liberation movements within the Catholic Church in Latin America by
Yep.
advancing American Pentecostal missionaries.
I'm gonna ask my editor to write another chapter on that alone. I mean, because and for people who are listening, a lot of the history that Joash is recounting, if you want to read someone, go read Rene Padilla, and a lot of his work,
Yeah.
because these were Latin American evangelicals who wrote letters to American evangelicals, like explaining their political position, explaining their theological position, and saying, really, theologically, there's nothing that differs between us, but you're writing us off theologically because of our particular political necessities that we're engaged in, the political situation on the ground. And it's just a fascinating way of understanding how American evangelicalism, to your point, has been wildly successful
Mm,
in providing a lot of the morality to make American empire continue to justify itself. And as much as that very much sounds and is an indictment, I'm also reminded of Thomas Merton and his statement, right, of saying, like, what we are really doing here is we are criticizing systems.
mm,
And he said, but insofar as we criticize systems and people identify with those systems, that's its own sort of prophetic. I'm paraphrasing him here, but that's its own sort of prophetic encounter. Is
yeah.
it realizing that I've been on the receiving end, and I'm sure you have too, Joash, of this notion of,
Okay.
well, this is attacking people, and 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 the response to that, I hope, is always, I'm we're not attacking people here. That if we're going to criticize, we criticize ideas, we criticize systems.
Yeah.
Um, but and this is where I think our past is so important in doing theology, is that um, my changes that I underwent was because I had a belonging, a community in my life that made that change uh, possible. And
Mm,
that is a very difficult line to walk, isn't it? I mean,
yeah.
that's
Yeah.
hard. But what we're talking about, American empire, and the ascendancy of this, you know, ultimately, we're talking about the power of ideas and systems, and that's not to deny,
Mm,
you know, agency, right? This
yeah.
is not nameless. This is not totally, without some sort of human participation. But I'm
Yeah.
always reminded, I think, too, of your work in highlighting Jesus's particular commitments to justice, and how even his parables, right, like, given to his countrymen under the occupation of Rome, to
Yeah.
say, go a second mile. We've made that a slogan for fast food service, but for Jesus, it was an essential practice of nonviolence, giving giving his countrymen their freedom, their liberation, while also shocking the Roman oppressor into an encounter with a human being. Like, who in their right mind is gonna
Mm,
go go to with this pact? Who is this person? Who turns that other cheek? So I think that's where the subversion comes from, is that the church is naming powers and principalities, right? That language, and unfortunately, conspiracism has sort of seized on that language to justify all sorts of suspicion, and I talk about that
yeah.
in the book.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love that. I love that, man. That's so great. And yeah, and just to also put things in context here, I love that you've written this book and that you are critiquing the American evangelical system, theological frameworks. And you know what? Those people are going to be okay
Mm.
after your critiques. They they're going to be okay. They can take it.
Yeah,
You know who can't take it right now? People being bombed to death in
right.
Gaza right now because of American evangelical theology. People being bombed to death in Iran right now.
Yeah.
People who were killed in Iraq. U.S. service members who were also killed there. Under the boot of empire themselves because of American evangelical theology. Like, so
Mhm.
why are we giving preferential treatment to the comfort of people
Right.
with power and privilege who are going to be okay
Yeah.
when their actions are actively harming people and children around the world today, right? So just to put things in context there, like, your work here is so important, and any kind of, empire shaped pushback coming your way is just telling on itself, quite honestly. And just, yeah, and again, to put things in perspective, God takes the side of people who are oppressed, and that's what I see you doing here in this book with this act of truth telling that's clearly making systems and powers and principalities um, just defensive, and on guard because of the nerves you're hitting here. But yeah, just really
Oh,
grateful for you for
I,
doing this work.
I just want to acknowledge. I mean, I think that's the turn. That you've just that's the the prophetic edge to all of this. Is because we're not just dealing with an academic problem to be solved, and theology is never um, conceptual in that way. That it always has, Cone said that all talk about God has to do with our neighbor and the oppressed, and if not, it has to
Mm,
be God talk. And so that I appreciate you bringing that edge out, um, because to the point where it just becomes, a back and forth about ethereal, conceptual stuff, and we um, very much isolate ourselves from the theological claims that are, and the political claims that are coming up to us, on us. Um, that's that's weighty, you know,
yeah.
that's weighty, and I appreciate you sort of very clearly naming the stakes.
Mm, mm. Jared, what was the most fun part of this book for you to write,
Ooh, most fun part. Um, man,
or the part that made you come alive the
that's a
most?
that's a really good question. Um, oh man, I'm not prepared for that question at all. Um, no, I mean, is it
This isn't my way of hazing you or initiating you into this,
no,
club of published authors,
no,
but
I love it. I mean, in some ways, I think what I really enjoyed was the work. Um, I remember hearing Ryan Johnson, who directed the most recent Knives Out film, and he also directed The Last Jedi. And he's a former like kind of evangelical youth group all star kid, and made a movie that only someone who's been through those experiences, and to write a film like he did about the church, in the church, about faith, it's just very obvious. And he said something that I think just captures sort of the joy of the work. As he goes, you feel like you want to work on it until it's done, like it's submitted, and that's it. So I think, and let me kind of bring it down to earth and talk about my stories. There's a portion in the book where I was starting to narrate like what it was like living in Tampa Bay growing up, and it was just it really wasn't doing any academic work. It was just fun language to try and describe this place that you're coming to in a couple months, and I'm excited about that.
yeah.
To describe my home, and so for listeners who don't know, like this part of our story is that we've come full circle. I no longer live in Scotland. If you can believe it or not, this fireplace is in Florida. So apparently, if get a mid-century, you live in a mid-century home from Florida, they still built these things here, and so I really enjoyed that. And so it's part of, I guess, being back home, where I was raised. That I just enjoyed that and part of it. And I think the other thing, and this goes to the audiobook, the only time that I sort of choked up in delivering the book was at the end, where I was doing the acknowledgments, and I was just reading through names. Some people are here still with us, others aren't. But especially at the end, like where I start talking about my kids,
Mm,
realizing, just all the things that were going on as this book was being, constructed, that, was meaningful. So yeah, that's a
wow.
question. I may come back with another answer later, but thanks for letting me narrate through that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love that. And I totally resonate with the part about choking up while reading the acknowledgments or
Yeah.
recording your audiobook. For me, I don't have kids, but funnily enough, it was the part about my dog that had me choked up. I was just like,
I
you
get
know,
it. I get it.
thanks for embodying Jesus to me is kind of what I said
Un,
there with
un,
unconditional love.
Consistent, consistent love. Absolutely. Hey, I don't know who's still watching, but do we have time to do maybe a couple questions from people
Yeah,
who I would,
yes,
if anyone has any questions,
let's do that.
we're
Let's
coming up.
do that.
So I did see a few that had been dropped in.
Yeah.
Brandon, very early on, Brandon asked a question. So Brandon, I don't know if you're still on, but we'll take a crack at it. It says, how does common sense realism play into the bent towards conspiracy theory? Um, that's a really good question. A lot of the work that I did in my dissertation that made its way into the book, sort of in the superstructure, was just talking about the Enlightenment and how we think about individualism. And so, if you sort of look at common sense realism as sort of another name or kind of, and these concepts are probably very different and are, but I really focus on individualism.
Mm,
And so we are all in many ways sort of just automatically, naturally think of ourselves as individuals, autonomous reasoning subjects who then perceive the world around us, in very direct ways. And that shows up in our conspiracy theorizing. And this isn't ideological. This isn't theological. I work with O'Malley's account of what he calls agency panic. So think about this. Every conspiracy theory that we probably heard everywhere is very keen on like an individual doing something. Like Bill Gates did XYZ. And the 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 suggestion from scholarship is, when people narrate the world that way, they're actually trying to preserve their belief that individual action matters, that direct, like that the world still works, even if it's evil people, that the world still works as if, like, if you want to do A, you do A, you do B happens. And so that our individualism, our commitment to understanding ourselves this way, that shows up. And that's another reason why it doesn't always emerge from within evangelicalism. It's referred to it. So that was a good question about common sense realism. I don't see any other questions coming through. So maybe we tapped a lot of bases. It is opening day, so there's a baseball analogy for everybody if you care about this.
yeah, love
I,
that. Love
I know
that.
Ben, so we need um
No, that's great, Jared. Jared, I know as we're, yeah, and would love to take more questions if
sure.
people here still have questions. Do drop them in the chat. But while folks are maybe doing that here, Jared, tell us a little bit about where folks can find you, how we can support your work,
Sure.
all
Yeah.
that good stuff, and where we can find your book.
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure you can find the book wherever books are sold. And I've made my way into a couple Barnes and Nobles, and but it's on Audible, it's on Spotify. If there's accessibility in that way, I'd really recommend the audiobook as a way to engage it, for a variety of reasons that I've already mentioned. If you're really looking to support indie booksellers, you can always buy from bookshop.org, which is great to do that. And you know what? The other thing I'd mention is libraries. Or just request it from your local library, and 99.9% of the time they will order it. And so I've
Yeah,
seen that a lot. There's a few libraries that are already carrying it, and so I would just say that as well. I'm always, as an author, and especially with a book like this, you're always very much. Oh, and I appreciate Morgan, who just dropped a link right there. Thank you, Morgan. Uh, I It's always very interesting and very encouraging to me to find, and I know you know this from the justice of Jesus, is just how the message gets passed and how readers find meaning that is worth sharing. And so, I can
yeah,
make recommendations about here are the purchase points, but like, I also know that the book exchanges hands too. And I just want to encourage people and like thank them, because I'm already hearing that now, and I think that's great. So that's the other way to probably engage is here on Substack. And you can find links to my Instagram. Is probably Instagram and Threads are probably the other two major ones that I'm on. And so, I will say this, part of the work in doing what I do is also taking very seriously the local church, but then also local civic organizations as well. I think we all have a vested interest in focusing in on this problem. And so this is something for people who are finding themselves in churches who are like, how do we push back on this? And then also civic organizations. There's organizing happening all around the United States that is
Mm.
bringing various groups together to express the power of citizenry in very compelling ways. So I think that's very 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 encouraging.
That's great. I
Uh,
see a few comments here.
I
The
do.
chat's
Uh,
popping.
yeah,
Jared, I'd love to actually. So, I mean, Umar has a really great question.
he does.
But before you get to that, selfishly, I'm going to go to Nate's question because I'm preaching on the Palm Sunday text. Still need to write my sermon. So
I saw Nate's
you.
question come through and I was like, that's Josh. Josh, you take it, man.
No, no, no. I mean, I want to know your answer so I can put it in my sermon, Jared. So, can you comment, Jared, on the significance of Palm Sunday for subverting empire?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll quote this. Marcus Borg is a New Testament scholar who introduced me to the a way of looking at Palm Sunday I never looked at before. And the historical criticism, right, that suggests that there was very much the way that he talks about Palm Sunday. I don't know if you've seen the film Sicario. Uh, there's a couple of others that it almost like a Black Hawk Down type of aesthetic where you start to hear things like security threats, right? Like he paints this picture of Passover week in Jerusalem that very much you can almost see occupying Roman forces realizing this city's a cinder block. It's about to blow. Um, and so I think that Marcus Borg's work focusing in on how Palm Sunday he shares this kind of crucial insight to the text that Pilate likely staged a triumphal procession into Rome or into Jerusalem rather, and it was a projection of Roman power, right? Like it was this warhorse type of entry meant to project power and subvert sort of any thinking that insurrectionary zealots were going to have a say in it. um Now there's a way of reading the New Testament that reads it solely as a resisting imperial propaganda, and I think those readings are viable, but I'd also add that the New Testament is also distinctly Jewish in the sense that the writers of the New Testament were Jewish and that they were deeply in touch, almost to the point where the allusions to the Old Testament are more than the citations. Um, they were deeply connected to the ongoing story of Israel and the people of God. And so when Jesus is riding in on a donkey, it's not just to contrast, the colt or the donkey with the Roman war horse. It's also to bring out the promises made in Zechariah. It's also to show the people of God, like God's faithfulness to the people of Israel. His promises are unfolding right before us. And there's something very powerful about Jesus's counter procession, which was very much, you could use the language of protest. You very much could use the language of demonstration. That Jesus's entrance, staged as it was, intentional as it was, um, also risked being misunderstood. That the palm branches were very much a Maccabean symbol, which was the last sort of violent revolt against Rome and pushing back against Greek powers that were occupying. So Jesus, in many ways, like sort of offered himself up to misunderstanding in that too. And so the reason I'm this is the work of Borg, but then I would also add um, the work of Willie Jennings, who sort of talks about the expectations of the oppressed in the book of Acts, and then also the oppressors, and how the way of the cross sort of subverts both of their expectations and creates a new people. And so I think it's actually pretty important in our time to identify that Jesus's counter procession to the Roman procession he's also subverting the expectations of his own countrymen as well.
Mm,
That there's a threefold dynamic going on here. The yes, the Jewish expectation for the promises of God were centered in on Jesus's messianic entrance, and people everywhere were interpreting that as this is Rome. That this city is about to blow. Like we are ready for the kingdom of God, and Peter's drawing the sword and ready. The significance of Palm Sunday is incontrovertibly tied to the significance of the crucifixion and Easter. And it's not just about unmet expectations, but it's also about a willingness to walk that way of the cross in confrontation. But in the book, I talk about Jesus's moment with Pilate, right? So that was sort of Palm Sunday coming to a head. I mean, why did they identify Jesus as a person of interest? Well, because of the way he entered the city and because of what he did in the temple. And so we cannot isolate Palm Sunday from Easter Sunday. That
mm.
these are all part of that altogether. So yeah, that's a whole book, Nate. I mean, and I didn't just comment, unfortunately. Gave a whole thing there. So, but let me cash that out. Is the significance of Palm Sunday? I think is first, right, the very real threat of empire, its claims to power, and
Mm,
also the very real desire among the oppressed for liberation, um, and the very subversive offering of Jesus, offering himself to be misunderstood, to be executed, all of those things. Um, and I think Palm Sunday is the setup for it all. And we can all find ourselves in that. So really maybe one of the questions we need to ask ourselves as we approach Palm Sunday is which procession are you in? Um, are you riding the war horse? Um, are you expecting though a Messiah um, without listening to the cross? Um, there's a lot of things that we
mm.
need, I think, with that. And
Wow.
so that's
Wow.
that. Marcus
Well,
Board, Willie Jennings, all of that.
thanks. And Jared, Stacy, thanks for inspiring my sermon this weekend. This is really great stuff. But yes, I love how we're linking it with empire.
Yep.
We tend to divorce empire from stories in scripture like this, and as long as we're reading it in context of empire and wrestling with it, I think we'll get to somewhere beautiful and somewhere true and authentic. And so thank you for so beautifully taking us through all that. Closing question here. Amar's question, the great Amar Peterman, a dear friend of ours, author of Becoming Neighbors, and uh, yeah, so great note to quote close this with, Jared. But tell us, is there an artifact, book, movie, song, etc., that
Mm.
you carried with you through the writing process of this book?
Um, Amr, I would probably say there's an essay by Dietrich Bonhoeffer called "After 10 Years," and it's not a piece of like academic writing. Like it for me, it's like a something I've inhabited, and
Wow.
I think probably that essay. I'm fascinated though by the movie and song bit of it. Um, you know, I don't know though if I have a playlist. I don't really I probably couldn't pin it on one song, but I'm gonna have to think about that because I think it's meaningful. So what I might do is take that question as inspiration for like creating a playlist. Here's a song for each chapter. I think James K. A. Smith does that, or Brian Zond certainly
Yeah,
writes a book. So maybe I'll think about that. No, that was a good
love
question.
it. Love it. Amar, for me, it's all Bollywood. It's A.R. Rahman, Shankar Ehsaan Loy, just these geniuses of Indian cinema who do, music, playback music. I feel like Bollywood is so aspirational because Indian culture is so aspirational. And so, like, yes, for me, getting to represent the community, being a published author, like it was just so aspirational for me that I had to be fueled by a lot of chai and Bollywood. So those were my artifacts personally. But really great question. Never been asked that
Yeah, that was.
before. Never.
I'm gonna think about it. Well,
Yeah.
and here's what I'll say, and this is very honest. I wrote this. That it's oh, you know what? It's a place. It's a place. Because where I wrote this in transition, um, and this is a
Mm,
credit to my in-laws. Like we were in transition from Scotland to here in Florida, and I wrote this in many times at my in-laws' house because we were staying with them on the way of this transition. So there's a place, there's a room in that house where this book came into being. So you know what, I'm like listening to you,
beautiful.
your answer about Bollywood and like what what that meant about representation. I was like, oh, like it's yeah, it's that space, that writing,
Yes.
that this book was born from.
Love it. Love it. Incredible stuff. Well, thank you all for joining us here tonight. And Jared, just so grateful for you, your friendship, the work we get to do. Oh, fun fact, by the way, um, this is just a bit of lore, but I introduced Jared to
Right.
our mutual agent now, Morgan. And so, in my head, I pat myself on
You
the back a little bit,
absolutely should.
stirring things up through you, Jared, here. So,
Well, and yeah, because because the context of all that was when I put my dissertation, that title out there, it blew up. It blew up then too, and so yeah, no, Morgan really is incredible, and both Joash and I are indebted to her, and I to Joash. So yeah, I appreciate that, Laura. I'll never forget.
it's just lore. I'm happy with it
Oh
just
no,
being lore.
it's
But
essential.
Jared, thank you for stirring up things. Thank you for spicing up our theological palette with these, liberative perspectives of Jesus, with this truth telling that upsets the palate, no doubt, but it's going to be good for us. It's going to cleanse us. And just really, really grateful for your work here. Thank you all for joining us. And, we will see you next time, either of us do a Substack live like this. Blessings, Jared. Blessings, you all.
Thank you. See you, everyone.